They say a man went out for catfish and came back with something the government spent the next 80 years pretending never existed. Copper bars stacked and shaped by hand, sitting in a dry chamber under a Texas lake bed that, according to every official map, was never dry and never held a cave at all. The story goes that within weeks of him talking, the Army Corps of Engineers sealed the entrance, poured it over, and let the water rise. And that was the end of it. No report, no survey, no record, which, if you ask the people who still whisper about it around the boat ramps at Texoma, is the whole point, because the things that get erased the fastest are the things that were never supposed to be found. Now, I want to be honest with you from the start, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves hype. There is no official document that says any of this happened. The Catfisherman is a name passed hand to hand, changing a little each time. The cave has never been photographed. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And the copper ingots, if they were ever real, are gone. So, what we have is a legend. But it is one of those legends that refuses to die. And the reason it refuses to die is that the pieces around it are all real. The dam is real. The drowned towns are real. The year is real. And the questions it forces you to ask about who built what and when, and why the answers keep coming up short, those questions are very real. So let's walk through it, slowly, and you can decide for yourself what to do with it. To understand the story, you have to understand the water. Before there was a Lake Texoma, there was a river valley, and it was full of people. The Red River wound along the border between Texas and Oklahoma, and for generations families had farmed the bottomland, buried their dead in little churchyards, and built towns with names most people have never heard, because those towns are at the bottom of a lake now. In the late 1930s, the federal government decided that river needed to be tamed. Flooding had wrecked the region for decades, and there was talk of hydroelectric power, of jobs, of progress. So they drew up plans for one of the largest earthen dams in the country. They called it Denison Dam. And in 1944, after years of labour, they finished it and let the reservoir fill. When a reservoir fills, it doesn't just cover land, it swallows it. Whole communities were relocated. Homes were abandoned or burned. Cemeteries were dug up and moved, though the stories in that part of the country will tell you that not all of them were, and that plenty of graves are still down there in the dark. Roads ended at the waterline. Bridges disappeared. An entire lived-in world went quiet under 100 feet of water in the span of a few seasons. Think about what that actually meant for the people who lived it. A man who was born in a house, whose father was born in that same house, gets a letter telling him the government is going to put a lake where his kitchen is. He watches surveyors walk his land. He watches crews come through and mark the trees. And then one day he loads a wagon, or a truck if he's lucky, and he drives away from everything his family built, and behind him the water starts to come up over the porch. Some people couldn't bear to watch. Some stood on the new high ground and watched anyway. Watched the church steeple go under last, the way you'd watch a coffin lowered. That happened to thousands of people in that valley. It was legal. It was called progress. And within 20 years, most of the country had forgotten it happened at all. And here is the thing that matters for our story. In the rush to flood that valley, a lot of ground got covered before anyone looked at it carefully. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how fast it happened. When you are moving a project that size, on that timeline, in the middle of a world war that needs the power and the flood control, you do not stop to catalogue every cave and creek bed and rock shelter. You clear what's in the way and you let the water do the rest. Which means if there was ever anything strange in that valley, anything nobody could explain, the easiest thing in the world would have been to let the water take it and never write it down. Not out of malice, just out of hurry. And a thing buried in a hurry is buried just as deep as a thing buried on purpose. That's the world our catfisherman is supposed to have stepped into. And this is where the story really begins. The way the old-timers tell it, this was a few years after the lake filled, when the water levels still swung wildly with the seasons because the reservoir was young and the Corps was still learning how to manage it. In a dry stretch, the shoreline could pull back dozens of yards, exposing mudflats and stumps and the tops of old fence posts from the drowned farms. Our man was working the flats at dawn, the way catfishermen do, following the retreating water to where the big channel cats hole up. And along a limestone bluff that was usually underwater, he found a gap, not a big one, just a dark slot in the rock, half choked with silt, that the falling lake had uncovered for the first time in who knows how long. Now most people, they see a hole in a rock and they keep fishing. But the story insists this man was curious, and that curiosity is what got him in trouble. He came back the next dry morning with a lantern. He dug the silt out of the opening with his hands until he could fit his shoulders through, and he crawled in. What he found, according to the legend, was not a natural cave, or not only a natural cave. The passage opened into a chamber, and the chamber was dry, bone dry, in a place that should have been drowned every single year. The walls, they say, were not just rough stone. They were worked, squared off in places, and along one wall, stacked like cordwood, like somebody had put them there on purpose and expected to come back, were the bars. Copper. Dozens of them, maybe more, each one heavy enough that he could only carry a few. Green with age on the outside, but bright metal underneath where he scratched them. And here's the detail that every version of the story keeps, the detail that makes people lean in. They weren't rough lumps, they were shaped, formed into a consistent size, with markings pressed into them. Markings nobody local could read. He took what he could carry. And that, they say, was his mistake. But before we get to the mistake, sit in that chamber with him for a second, because the detail the story lingers on is the markings. He's kneeling in a dry room that shouldn't exist, holding a bar of metal that's heavier than it has any right to be, and he scratches the green crust off with his thumbnail, and there's bright copper underneath, catching his lantern. And pressed into the face of the bar is a set of marks, not letters he knew, not numbers. The way it gets described, it was something between a stamp and a symbol, repeated on bar after bar like a maker's mark or a measure of weight or a sign of ownership. And that's the thing that supposedly turned his stomach cold. Because a symbol means a system. A symbol means somebody had a reason to label these, an economy that needed them counted, a hand that expected other hands to read the mark and know what it meant. He wasn't looking at treasure, he was looking at inventory. Somebody's stored wealth, catalogued and shelved, in a room sealed off from a world that had no memory of them at all. He grabbed what his arms would hold, and the story says he crawled back out into the daylight shaking, and not from the cold. Let's pause here, because this is where a good story could just keep piling on drama, and I'd rather do something more useful. I want to talk about why the copper is the part that hooks people. Because on its own, a guy finding some old metal in a cave is a shrug. Prospectors, moonshiners, and native peoples all used caves in that region. Copper itself is not exotic. What makes believers sit up is the form. An ingot, a cast and shaped bar of refined metal, is not something you stumble into by accident. It represents a whole chain of knowledge. Someone had to mine the ore. Someone had to smelt it, which means high heat, controlled and sustained. Someone had to cast it into a repeatable shape. And someone had to stack it deliberately as stored wealth in a hidden place. That is not a campfire, that is industry. And official history says there was no industry like that in that valley at that scale before the modern era. So the ingots, if real, are a contradiction. They are a thing that shouldn't be there. And a thing that shouldn't be there is the beginning of every question worth asking. This is the doorway into the bigger idea, the one that has quietly built a massive following online over the last decade. Some people call it the lost civilization theory. Others attach it to the word Tartaria. And I want to explain what that actually means fairly before we go on, because it's easy to mock and harder to understand. The core claim is this: the story we've been handed about the past, that human capability rose in a smooth line from primitive to advanced, is wrong. Believers argue there was an earlier, more advanced global culture, one that had metallurgy, architecture, energy, and engineering far beyond what the timeline allows, and that this culture was somehow wiped out, buried, or erased, whether by a natural catastrophe, a great flood of mud, or a deliberate rewriting of the record by the powers that inherited the ruins. In this view, a lot of what we call old is actually salvage. Grand buildings we credit to the 1800s were, they say, inherited from something older and simply reoccupied. The official story in this frame isn't just incomplete, it's a cover story. Now, professional historians reject this firmly, and they have good reasons, which we'll get to because you deserve both sides. But you can see instantly why a chamber of unexplained copper ingots under a lake, sealed by a government agency, fits this worldview like a key in a lock. If you already believe an advanced past was buried and erased, then a literal example of buried, erased metalwork isn't a surprise. It's a confirmation. It's the thing you were told didn't exist, showing up exactly where the theory says it should. So, back to our man. He hauls his copper home, and depending on who's telling it, he tries to sell a piece, or he shows it off at a feed store, or he takes it to somebody in town who knows metals. And word spreads. In a small community in the 1940s, word always spreads. And the word reaches the wrong ears, because remember who was in that valley. The Army Corps of Engineers didn't build a dam and leave. They stayed. They managed the lake, monitored the water, controlled the land around it. It was, in a real sense, their reservoir. So the story goes that when talk of a cave and a stash of strange metal started circulating, men from the Corps came asking questions. Polite at first. Where did you find it? Can you show us? And our catfisherman, not knowing any better, showed them. And after that, the legend says, everything changed. The bluff was declared off limits. When the next dry season came and people went looking for the slot in the rock, it was gone. Not hidden. Gone. The story says the entrance had been collapsed and packed, the loose stone poured over with something that set hard, blended into the bluff so you'd never know a gap had ever been there. And then the Corps did what the Corps does best. They managed the water. They kept the level up over that stretch so it stayed drowned, so nobody would ever have the dry morning that started the whole thing again. And you have to admit, if you were going to hide something forever, that's the method with no seam in it. You don't post a guard, you don't build a fence that invites questions. You just raise the water a few feet and hold it there, and let the lake do the guarding for you quietly, permanently, for free. No one questions a high lake. No one files a complaint about a reservoir being full. The perfect cover is the one that looks like nothing at all, like ordinary weather, like the normal business of running a dam. The cave, whatever it was, went back under, permanently. And the man? Here the versions split. Some say he was paid, quietly, and told to keep his mouth shut, and he lived out his life, uneasy and rich enough not to complain. Others say he was simply ignored so completely, so officially, that when he told the story, people started to look at him funny, and eventually even he wondered if he'd dreamed it. The copper he'd kept, the few bars he carried out, those supposedly disappeared too, sold and melted, or taken, or lost in a house fire, or buried by the man himself out of fear. Every trail ends the same way, in nothing, in water, in silence. There's one more thread, the old-timers add, and it's the kind of detail that either makes the story or breaks it, depending on your mood. They say he wasn't the only one who saw it, that before the Corps came in those first few days when he was still showing the copper around, one other man went out with him to the bluff. A friend, a neighbour, somebody who wanted to see it with his own eyes. And that this second man got a look at the slot in the rock, maybe even put his head inside, before the water came back up and the whole thing was declared off limits. And for years afterward, so the story goes, this second man was the one who kept it alive. He'd tell it at the domino hall, tell it to his grandkids, tell it to anyone who'd sit still. He never had a bar of his own to show. He never had a photo, but he'd swear on anything you put in front of him that it was real, that he saw the dark gap in the limestone with his own eyes. Before I go further, that that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And that one dry morning it was simply gone, the rock face smooth where the hole had been. And when people asked him why he thought the government would bother, he'd get quiet and he'd say the same thing every time, that it's not about what the copper was worth, it's about what the copper meant, and that some things are worth more buried than they'd ever be worth dug up. Whether that second man ever existed, I can't tell you. But he's a revealing invention if he is one, because he's exactly the witness the story needs. He's the corroboration that can't be checked, the second voice that makes it feel less like one man's tall tale and more like a shared memory. And that's how legends armour themselves against doubt. They grow a second witness, then a third, until the not knowing feels like a conspiracy instead of an absence, which is exactly the problem and exactly the appeal. Here's what I mean. If you're a skeptic, and you should keep a little skeptic alive in you at all times, the total absence of evidence is the whole case against this. There is no ingot in a museum, there is no photo, there is no survey map with a cave marked on it, no memo, no work order for a sealing operation. The believer says that's because it was covered up. The skeptic says that's because it never happened. And you cannot use the missing evidence to prove the cover-up, because a thing that never existed leaves behind the exact same amount of nothing as a thing that was perfectly erased. That's the trap at the center of every story like this. Absence can mean hidden. Absence can mean fictional. And from the outside they look identical. But I don't think that means we just stop and shrug, because the interesting move here isn't to prove or disprove the cave. It's to ask why this specific story attached itself to this specific place. And when you look at that, things get genuinely strange in a way that has nothing to do with faith. Start with the copper itself and step back from Texoma for a minute. There is a real, documented, deeply weird chapter of North American history involving copper, and it's the kind of thing that makes even mainstream researchers admit the timeline has soft spots. Up around the Great Lakes, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, there are ancient mining pits. Thousands of them. Some of them go down into solid rock, and the copper found up there is famous for being unusually pure, the kind you could work with simple tools straight out of the ground. And the estimates of how much copper was pulled out of that region in antiquity are staggering, far more than the archaeological record can fully account for in terms of where it all went. People have argued about this for over a century. Where did all that copper go? Who moved it? And how far did the trade in worked metal actually reach across this continent before anyone wrote it down? Because here's what's not in dispute. Worked copper from those northern sources has turned up at sites hundreds and hundreds of miles away, carried down ancient trade routes by people whose networks we're still mapping and still underestimating. The continent before written records was not a scatter of isolated tribes. It was crossed by roads of exchange, by rivers of goods and metal and ideas, moving distances that would surprise most people who only ever learned the cartoon version of pre-contact America. That's not fringe. That's a real open question, with real dirt behind it. So when a legend pops up about worked copper turning up somewhere it shouldn't be, it isn't landing in a vacuum. It's landing on top of a genuine mystery that historians already argue about. The legend borrows the credibility of the real question. It says, in effect, you already admit you don't know where all that copper went. So why couldn't some of it have ended up here, stacked and sealed under my lake? Now bring it back to Texoma. Why would a story like this stick to a reservoir in Texas of all places? And I think the answer is the drowning. There is something about deliberately covering land with water that does a specific thing to the human imagination. When you flood a valley, you don't just move people out. You create a sealed box. Everything that was down there is still down there, but it's now unreachable, unverifiable, permanent. You've created a place that is real and physical and utterly beyond inspection. And the mind cannot leave a sealed box alone. It fills it with the drowned town, sure, and the moved graves, but also with whatever else it wants to believe was there. A reservoir is a machine for manufacturing legends because it takes real ground and puts it forever out of reach, which is the exact condition a good conspiracy needs to breathe. And it gets one layer stranger because of who did the sealing. The Army Corps of Engineers is not a spooky secret agency. They build dams and dredge harbours, but in the mind of a story, they're perfect. They are a federal body with the authority to control land, the equipment to move earth and stone, and the mandate to manage water levels. If you wanted to invent an organisation capable of making a cave disappear and stay disappeared, you could not design a better one than the actual agency that already controlled that lake. The story didn't have to reach for a shadowy cabal. It just pointed at the men who were genuinely, publicly in charge of the water. And that's what gives it teeth. The villain is plausible because the villain was really there. So let's steelman the believers for a second, honestly, because they're not all fools, and the strongest version of their argument is worth hearing. They would say this: look at the pattern, not just the one story. Look at how many times, across how many places, the same shape keeps repeating. Someone finds worked metal, or dressed stone, or a structure that doesn't fit the timeline. It gets reported briefly, and then it goes quiet. The artifact is lost or reclassified or explained away or simply never studied. They'd argue that mainstream history has every incentive to protect its own timeline, because careers, textbooks, and entire institutions are built on it, and an anomaly that big is not welcome. They're not necessarily saying men in suits burn evidence in a furnace. They're saying a system can suppress an inconvenient fact through nothing more than disinterest, embarrassment, and the quiet decision not to look. And honestly, that softer version is hard to dismiss completely, because science really has, throughout its history, ignored things that didn't fit until it couldn't anymore. And they'd point out that Texoma isn't alone. Every region of this country has its version. The dressed stone wall in the hills that a farmer swears is older than any settler. The tunnel found during a construction dig that got quietly backfilled before anyone photographed it. The strange foundation under an old building that doesn't match the building on top of it. Believers collect these the way other people collect coins, and laid side by side, they do seem to rhyme. The same shape over and over, something found, something reported, something gone. And to a certain kind of mind, a pattern that repeats that cleanly can't be coincidence. It has to be design. It has to mean that somewhere there's a hand on the record deciding what stays and what sinks. That's the emotional engine of the whole Tartaria idea. Not any single artifact, but the feeling that the anomalies are too many and too similar to all be accidents. That the water rising over the cave at Texoma is just one small local instance of a much larger flood, a flood of forgetting that washed over the whole world and left us standing in the ruins calling them our own. It's a feeling with real pull to it, and I won't pretend otherwise. But a feeling of pattern is not the same as a proven pattern, and this is where I have to turn the lantern the other way. The single biggest problem is the one we already named. There is no artifact. In almost every field of inquiry, an extraordinary claim needs a physical anchor, one thing you can hold, test, date, and put behind glass. This story has none. It has only testimony, and testimony that has passed through so many retellings that the man's name, the year, the number of bars, and the location on the lake all shift depending on who's talking. That's not the signature of a suppressed fact. That's the signature of folklore, which grows and mutates precisely because there's nothing solid to pin it down. Second, the plainest explanation for copper in a cave in that region is not a lost civilization. It's the last few hundred years. That country saw prospectors, smugglers, moonshiners, and yes, the sophisticated metalwork and trade networks of native peoples who were in that land for millennia and who absolutely worked and traded copper. If a real man really found real metal in a real cave, the least exotic and most likely answer is that it came from a known human hand within known history. The leap to a vanished super-civilization skips over a dozen ordinary explanations that all fit better. And third, the Tartaria framework as a whole runs into a wall the moment you ask it to be specific. It's compelling as a mood, as a feeling that the past is bigger and stranger than we're told. But when you press it for mechanisms, it strains. A globe-spanning advanced civilization would leave enormous physical footprints in genetics, in language, in tools scattered everywhere, in a mountain of evidence that would be far harder to hide than a single cave. The absence of that mountain is a real problem the theory has never solved. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, I think, in the most honest and the most interesting place possible, which is not a verdict but a live question. Because you can hold two things at once. You can believe correctly that the specific tale of the Catfisherman and the sealed cave is almost certainly a legend, unprovable and probably untrue in its details. And you can also feel honestly that the reasons the legend works are pointing at something genuine. The copper mystery of North America is real. The soft spots in the timeline are real. The human habit of losing, ignoring and paving over inconvenient history is real. The drowning of that valley, the moved graves, the sealed box under the water, all real. The story is fiction built on a foundation of true unease. And that's why it survives, not because people are stupid, but because it names a suspicion a lot of people already carry. The suspicion that the official story is too neat, that the line from primitive to modern is too smooth, that somewhere under the water or under the dirt or under the textbook the record is missing pieces that somebody at some point decided we didn't need to see. Here's the thing about a sealed cave under a lake. You can't check. You will never be able to check. The water is still there. The Corps still manages the level exactly as they have since 1944 for reasons that are completely mundane and documented and have nothing to do with any cave. But knowing the boring reason doesn't stop the mind from doing what minds do. Every time the lake drops in a drought, and it does drop, someone walks that shoreline and looks at the limestone bluffs a little too long. Every dry summer the story gets told again at a bait shop or a campfire, and it picks up a new detail and a new believer, and it rolls on into the next generation intact. Maybe there was a man, maybe he found a hole in a rock, maybe there was copper, and maybe it was old prospector's stock, or a native cache, or nothing at all but a good story told by a man who liked attention. Or maybe, just maybe, he crawled into a chamber that had been dry and sealed and waiting since before anyone in that valley could name a date. And he touched something that was never supposed to surface, and men with the authority to erase it made it disappear back into the dark. We don't know. We can't know. And that gap, that permanent water-filled, government-managed gap, is where the whole thing lives. I'll leave you with the part that actually keeps me up, and it isn't the copper. It's the drowning itself. Because whatever the truth of the cave, one thing is not a legend. In 1944, this country decided a valley full of homes and history and human bones was worth less than a wall of water, and it flooded the whole thing and moved on, and most people today have no idea it's down there at all. A living world went silent under that lake and became unreachable in a single generation. And that's the quiet horror underneath the fun of a story like this. Not that the government hides caves full of ancient copper. There's no evidence it ever did. The real unease is simpler and harder to shake. It's how easily a place can vanish, how little it takes. Not a catastrophe, not a mud flood, not a grand conspiracy erasing an advanced civilization. Just a decision, a budget, a project, and a few seasons of rising water. That's all it took to erase that valley. And we did it in the full light of the 20th century, with newspapers running the story and engineers stamping the plans, and still, 3 generations later, it's a footnote almost nobody knows. So if we can lose that much that fast on purpose with everyone watching, then ask yourself the real question the story is actually asking. How many other valleys are down there? Under how many other lakes? Holding how many other things we decided not to remember? The Catfisherman's cave might be a myth, but the instinct behind it, the sense that the ground beneath us is heavier with buried history than we're comfortable admitting, That part might be the truest thing in the whole story. The water keeps its secrets. It always has. And it is very, very patient. And patience, in the end, is the only thing a lake has ever really needed to keep a thing buried deep.